Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Lucas Pinheiro, and I teach politics here at Bard. And I'm delighted to be in a conversation about friendship with a scholar whose work I deeply admire and whose generous practice of friendship is as inspiring as her thoughts about it. Ann Norton is a political theorist and the Stacey and Henry Jackson President's Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of numerous essays and 7 books, including Leo Strauss and the Politics of American Empire, Reflections on Political Identity, 95 theses on politics, culture, and method, and on the Muslim question, among other books. Her latest book is titled Wild Democracy, Anarchy, Courage, and Ruling the Law, which was published earlier this year by Oxford University Press. I'm very much looking forward to hearing her thoughts on friendship today. And to begin our conversation, I'd like to reflect on a passage about friendship from her 1988 book, Reflections on Political Identity, which I think perfectly captures the spirit of this panel. Remarking on Nietzsche's comment about the esteem the Greeks held for friendship as the apogee of human feeling, Anne wrote the following about the intimacy of friendship and philosophy. Friendship, like philosophy, is marked by magnanimity. Friends are sufficient unto themselves. Each can embrace, each can comprehend the other. Together they possess the sufficiency and magnanimity philosophers possess in solitude. Like philosophers, friends are made great not by what they have, but by their understanding of what they lack. With the help of Nietzsche and Aristophanes, she arrives at an important conclusion about friendship in our time, including how much closer we are to Hegel on this question than we are to Nietzsche or the Greeks, as a society that privileges sexual union over friendship. As Anne puts it, the privileging of sexual union in our time carries all the marks of scriptural monotheism. It is written on the body. It is inscribed in the law. It has its consummation in union. Friendship does not. It is not written upon the body. It is not inscribed in law. Friendships are ambivalent and contradictory. Friends are united by what they are and what they are not, by the desires they possess in common, and by the consequences of their separation from one another. Friends do not regret their differences. Their separation in body and mind gives each to the other as an object of reflection, of desire, and as a means of overcoming singularity. This is beautifully put. This powerful image of friends giving each other up as objects of desire, as a means of overcoming singularity, raises key questions about the modern separation of friendship and sexual union. I think it's important that Anne centers desire here because it invites us to interrogate how that desire differs or does not differ from the desires that govern the hegemony of sexual union in our monotheistic paradigm. Anne's work on friendship pushes us also to historicize the invidious hierarchy of friendship and sexual union as a recent development in Western thought. Plato's Symposium could be one source we might invoke to illustrate the point that our distinct desires were once in flux and yet highly structured along unequal relations of power, characteristic of a patriarchal society. Here, an education in the virtues of Athenian citizenship created not only a bond of mentorship, but also one of love and eros. Importantly, however, this relationship, this homosocial bond, as we might call it, could only flourish between males who commanded the labor of women and slaves. I mentioned this with another book in mind, Eve Sedgwick's Between Men from 1985, where she famously described homosocial desire in the 18th and 19th centuries as an emerging pattern of male friendship that cannot be understood outside of its relation to women and the gender system as a whole. As much then as now, these patterns of friendship between men were characterized by patriarchy and homophobia. And as Sedgwick put it, to draw the homosocial back into the orbit of desire of the potentially erotic is to foreground the potential unbrokenness of a continuum between homosocial and homosexual, a continuum whose visibility for men in our society is radically disrupted in a way that it is not for women. Sedgwick chooses the word desire over love as a marker of the erotic emphasis of homosociality because unlike love, which names a particular emotion, desire names a structure, an analog to the psychoanalytic use of libido. That is, not a particular affective state or emotion, but the affective or social force or structure. The eminence of desire in homosociality pushes us to question how the shapes of sexuality and what counts as sexuality at once depend on and affect historical power relationships. The most compelling example of this is the way in which, according to Sedgwick, the opposition between the homosocial and the homosexual seems to be much less thorough and dichotomous for women in our society than for men. In other words, the homosocial desire between male friends, so prevalent in Victorian society, was a pretense for both patriarchal and homophobic sentiments, insofar as these bonds rested pointedly on two reinforcing presumptions. First, on the view of men as being superior friends and companions to women, and second, on the idea that since these relationships are said to be based on purely platonic rather than sexual desire, homosociality itself cannot be homoerotic. This makes Anne's point about friendship ever more pressing. Even if some forms of friendship have been historically corrupted by deep-rooted asymmetries of power in our society, Anne invites us to disaggregate what is contingent and what is constitutive about friendship, and namely here, its potential to overcome singularity. And this is precisely the note on which Anne ends reflections on political identity. She writes, "The ascendancy of scripture marks the triumph of the logos, of writing and rationality, of the phallus. The ascendancy of union in sexuality, in politics, in the conviction of a common species, marks the triumph of the singular God." In this time, we become practitioners of philology, opposed to logic as philosophers to sophistry, recognizing ourselves in the desire of the word and in our recognition of its absence. Perhaps it is to this idea of friendship that we should return. And this might be one of the reasons not only why friendship matters, but why friends matter. And as Anne writes, it is not form but content that is regarded. It is not friendship that is loved, but a particular friend. Thank you.
I'm much smaller than he is. And that was me in my high French mode. I'm not in the high French mode anymore, so don't worry. I want to begin with a tribute to Uday Mehta, who was supposed to be here today. Uday is an old friend of mine, and I felt that I had to note his absence here. We met at the home of a friend that we had and still have in common. Uday was coming up the basement stairs, and he looked around the door with an air of kind of tentative and impish devilry. It was a good and very appropriate beginning because Uday opened a lot of doors to me. Like all friends, he made me think of new things in new ways. But we did what friends always do together. We made food and we ate it together. There is a deep materiality to friendship, I think. We traveled around with his great big spaniel in my lap. We talked, we argued, we laughed, we told each other a lot about ourselves and our families. And we gave each other ideas. I owe a whole book to Uday because while we were watching the Olympics together, we made a bet that I could not write 95 theses about anything. I won. So I grew up moving every 2 or 3 years, and one of the things I learned from that, apart from being an excellent packer, is that I learned that there are a few people you can always return to, and you return as if no time had intervened. I miss Uday, and I'm sorry that today is not the day in which I see him again. Lucas did a lot of work for me by beginning exactly where I wanted to begin, but I had more reticence about reading my own work, which is why friendship is better than sex. And this is a very old view, and a very Greek view in many ways, but just a very old view. I mean, think of the hunger to possess the other that shows itself in Aristophanes' myth and the Symposium, or those religious and secular ceremonies or popular expressions that speak of sexual partners, lovers, as becoming one flesh. Think of the way that sexual relations are formalized and legalized to serve as channels for property. Think of the policing of sexuality. Not only you cannot, but you must. And the ancient Greeks really did think of it differently, or at least they opened the possibility of thinking about it differently. They had an enormous reverence for friendship. So indeed did the Vikings, the Old Norse, whom I have a great fondness for because of their disdain for property rights, their willingness to share, and their affection for friendship. In fact, there's an Old Norse poem that says, if you have a friend, it's not working again. All right, I'll come closer. I was warned about this, sorry. If you have a friend, visit him often, bring him gifts, and share meals together. And there is a kind of simple materiality in that demand for presence, in that tiny picture of what friendship should be that I think is very important. The Greeks did consider friendship a particularly high activity, something that was higher than erotic love. That erotic love was often figured by them as a desire to dissolve in the other, to possess the other, to be at one with the other. But friendship is exactly the other way. It is a shared thing, and a friend and student of mine once quoted the Talmud to me when she said that some things like health are like fire, that the more you share it, the more it increases. And friendship, I think, works along the same logic. Friends are sufficient unto themselves, but no one is dissolved into one another. The more you share, the more you have. That in your friend, you have someone who is both the other and one's own, that you can look on, that you can be surprised by. I think one of the great gifts of friendship is, yes, you may tell people your deepest secrets, but you will never really know them. And the joy, it's not that you're not knowing them is a kind of deprivation. Your not knowing them is a source of endless joy. They just surprise you all the time. I have known my best friend for a little more than 50 years. And she surprises me every day. That capacity to startle, to give you the new, is one of the things that I think friendship is best for. Also, friends love their differences. It's not that you love your friend because they are like you. You love your friend also because they are not you, because they are something different, because they have dimensions and capacities and skills that you don't have. They have pasts that you don't have. They have cultural differences sometimes that you don't have. And so that when you have a friend, you get another life that is your own. Not as possession, but as entry, as a place to live. And that ability to live in another place, in another world, is another of the great gifts of friendship. Luckily, I don't need those. Now, this is part of the reason why I think friendship matters for politics. I think, and I actually argue in my new book, that friendship is training for democracy in many ways, because it, first of all, it presents to your mind the possibility that two know more than one. Or, more importantly, that two can remedy each other's intellectual and ethical lack. That you can make yourself greater in your friendships, and that across relations of people, a common wisdom can arise, which is not the wisdom of the prophet or the leader or any of those singularities, but the wisdom of the common people. I was very interested in I actually felt an unexpected affinity with Hannah Arendt, with whom I have a very contentious relationship, even though she's dead. Yeah, well, yeah. And that's a good relationship. That's the other thing about friends. You can argue with them. You not only can argue with them, you must argue with them, because it is the character of the relationship that you confront their differences, that you are not the same person. You all argue with them. So I was surprised by that. And largely, almost completely, I agreed with her. But I'm a little bit puzzled about truth. I don't think it's about truth. And I think one of the things about friendship is that it constantly reminds you of what you don't know. What you don't know, even about that which you know best, which is to say, your friend, you still don't know. And that constant reminder of your own fallibility, of your own lack, your own imperfect possession of any truth is a really very good thing for any human. That we have to face that fallibility, and having someone who will poke you and tell you deliberately or show you that you are fallible is much more important than the idea that a friend gives you access to a perfect truth. So that too, I think, is very valuable for democracy, and of course for valuing and embracing difference, and for the commons, for the presence, the utility, and the pervasiveness of things which cannot be owned, that things which fall outside relations of property. This is one of the problems with sexuality in our culture, but in so many cultures, is that sexuality has been made a really great channel for passing property around. That's what it does. And I learned this most vividly when I was filling out a domestic partnership thing so my partner could have health care. And I thought, oh, they're going to ask me about things that I do not think are their business. No. They asked me, do we have bank accounts? Are we mentioned in each other's wills? Do we own things in common? In other words, queerness has not evacuated or severed the link between sexuality and property, which frankly needs to be severed, and the sooner the better. That monetization of sexuality, not in something like prostitution, but in the ordinary structures of our engagement with property, I think, has had devastating consequences. And friendship stands against those. Friendship doesn't require possessing anything in common, but everything. As Aristotle quite correctly said, friends have everything in common. You could ask your friend for food, for water, for shelter, for whatever you need on any occasion. And moreover, you won't have to ask. It's also a good training for the democratic because it is so consensual. The first time somebody says to you, you must be friends with so-and-so, or attempts to construct relations of friendship, as it were, dictatorially, it's not friendship, it's something else. It might be a social relationship, even a social relationship of some value, but it's not friendship. Friendship just happens. As your boys say, it just happens. You just know, it just happens. And it is profoundly consensual. There is also something about friendship that I don't quite know how to broach, but I think it's important, and that is politics functions not only through friendship, but also through enmity. And in I think, undervaluing what friendship is, we also have learned bad ways to be an enemy. I mean, historically and in literature, there are so many examples of how to be a good enemy. First of all, you should be an honorable enemy. You have to be an honorable enemy in order to be an honorable person. And you have to live, particularly in democracies, with people who are your enemies. I mean, how can you live in this world now, in the United States, and not recognize that we must live with our enemies? You don't have to like them. You don't have to agree with them. You don't have to take them for your own. And you don't even, in my opinion, necessarily always have to treat them with the greatest respect. But you have to live, in order to be a decent human being, you have to learn how to live with honor among them. And you have to learn to walk among them without fear. So that requires, it is in some ways the corollary of friendship. It's not the binary of friendship, as people like Schmidt, who really, people do not need to listen to Schmidt anymore. It's just no. He is my enemy, and I'm happy to have him. And I would put Derrida in that bunch, too. When Derrida says in The Politics of Friendship, he quotes this epigraph, "Oh, friend, there is no friend," which he attributes to Aristotle, knowing perfectly well that it is not Aristotle. It's just attributed to Aristotle. You know, no fraudulence, but also, oh, friend, there are plenty of friends. And, God willing, you will have one. And maybe more, but you don't have many. Friendship is a rare thing. Friendship is a special thing. And that is true also with enemies. That you have to learn, you have to pick them well, because they will affect how you grow and what your life is like. And you have to treat them honorably, not because of them, but because of you. Because your honor is at stake. I know honor is not necessarily a current thing to think about, but I think it is necessary in both enmity and friendship that friends don't care about your reputation, but friends care deeply about your honor and theirs. And that is one lesson that goes well beyond friendship to the conduct of all our political relations. And finally, one of the things I like most about friendship is friendship's lawlessness. Friendship has a kind of anarchic, unregulated joy about it. There's no reason why you must be friends, but you can be friends with whoever you want. Nobody regulates it. It's an ungoverned relationship. It's outside and untouched by any state, no contracts, no ketubah, no registration, nothing. It's just you and that person. It's even unrecognized largely by corporations. People rarely sell you things about friendship. They sell you things about sex all the time, but not friendship. It has largely evaded the touch of capital. It's wholly consensual. It can be dissolved at any moment. It can arise at any moment. And so it is very free. And it teaches us the beauty and the power and the grace of the ungoverned and the anarchic. Thank you.
Hi.
Get to talk, and you get to talk. Yes.
Thank you. And I wanted to begin by asking about the last point that you made about your most recent book about lawlessness, like the anarchic content of friendship. Is that what you see as the sort of democratic efficacy of friendship, right? Like you're saying that friendship can teach us something about democracy. There's a lesson in that. Is part of this anarchic, lawless, ruleless idea of friendship part of that? Because we can easily associate democracy also as compliance to certain rules, as civility,
rule of law, all those things.
Sociability and so on.
No, I think we very often now mistake liberalism for democracy. And I am a big fan of democracy. I am quite ambivalent about liberalism. This is not because I think democracy always gives you a good outcome, although I think it more often gives you a good outcome than people admit, but because because liberalism makes you do things which are undemocratic and in some ways unhuman, like not judge. You have a conflict with your neighbor. Do you go talk to your neighbor? No, you call the police. What a ridiculous thing to do. And also dangerous for your neighbor, but possibly for you too. Or why do we need the state to settle conflicts? And also, and this is deeper, what about this fundamental notion that your life should be guided by rules? Now, I recognize that this has given us many good things. It is a very good idea to have street signs and street lights, although please don't obey those all the time either. If nobody's on the road, just go ahead. You can jaywalk. I think you should jaywalk from time to time. So a certain judgment about every rule is called for. It's not just, so one of the things I argue in that book is, it's not, you shouldn't say the rule of law. You should say, I rule the law. You should always ask, what law? Jim Crow law? You want to obey that? You should not be obeying that. There are many bad laws, and you should disobey them. And you should judge the law. And that capacity for judgment is exactly what I think you get taught when you set the rules aside a little bit.
Yeah, I wonder if people now find it perhaps more challenging to make friends. I don't know what kind, friendships take different forms, and I think that the context in which you meet, like you mentioned this idea of like you must be friends with this person because I like them and you have this thing in common, right? And it's kind of like how is it that we meet? Like do these friendships have to be meaningful? Like at the end of the day, should you feel isolated or lonely because you actually at the end of the day figure out that you don't have that many friends, and this idea sounds very good, and actually it sounds amazing, and I wonder, right, like is there like the reverse of that, this sort of the weight of being friendless, today maybe we find it more difficult to make these lasting and meaningful connections today, or maybe not. I just don't know what sort of kind of friendship lends itself to that. I don't know if you could speak.
I'm going to sound very political sciencey for a moment. In many ways, I think friendship in human life is a lot like what Weber said about charisma or grace. It just comes. And that means it's very hard to look for it. But I think that it's not, and I've been thinking a lot about this. I've been thinking about it in some ways since I was a child, because I once got in terrible trouble in grade school because I was told, but the teacher said, you need to be friends with someone, with this guy, I forget his name. And I hadn't fought with the person, I had no conflict with the person, but I was appalled at the idea that she thought I could do that friendship already meant a lot to me. I had a good friend. I didn't think that you could just be friends with somebody as a request. And I was too young to realize that she didn't understand friendship as I did, and that what she was asking for was something much smaller. But it did embed in my mind, because I had to consider her response to me, and that I was right and she was wrong. You can't just be friends with somebody in a thoroughgoing and meaningful sense. But that means, how do you find friends? And guess what? You're probably not going to have a real friend, all your life. For some of your life, you probably will, and for some of your life, after all, people die, and this is something. This is one of the real things. If you have a friend, you may lose them, and this is terrible. So you have to, in some ways, ready yourself for this. But then you go looking for friends, and of course, it is important in some of your life to have a good friend. And how do you find a friend? And I'm very struck by the fact that most people find their friends in college. Now, why do you find your friends in college? I think there are two reasons for this. One, you're around a lot of people, and you talk to them a lot. When you're at work, what you can say to the people you work with is limited, and you're probably not really around very many of them, except in perhaps, fundamentally client-patron relationships. So that's a hard place to find friends. I can see why some people find friends at their church or shul or mosque or whatever. But I think college is a particularly good cultivator of friendship for another reason, and that is because you sit around and talk a lot, and you sit around and talk about really important things so that your mind is prepared to value important things and to look for them in others, so that it is very hard to replace that moment. And it is unfortunate that for most of us, that moment is very limited in time. For those of us who are lucky enough to be in the academy our whole life, it is a bit different. But it never, I think, has quite that openness and equality that you have as a student when you go to college. And we might think about how to make more of that in the world.
On that, do you think that the Greeks perhaps were able to think of friendship in a more productive way and sort of praise it more than sexual union, for instance, in part because of certain structures of that society that are perhaps missing? Some of them continue, but you're mentioning college, for instance. Maybe the erosion of common spaces, of civil societies, of places in which people frequent and go outside of college, right? Do you need a certain type of society, a certain type of democracy, a certain type of political economy, relation to property, in order to actually cultivate the types of friendships that would be meaningful in the sense of being a productive way to foster the spirit of democracy, right? I mean, would it be totally unfeasible to then say to someone in college today, right, like, this is how friendship was thought of in antiquity, or maybe in the Victorian era, where, like the homosocial idea of, like, men sitting on each other's laps and taking photographs with each other and holding hands on the streets and so forth. It's kind of like all of these, right, historical moments of friendship in particular societies. Like, is the one that is available to us today, or is that too deterministic, right? Is that too sort of like bowling alone?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think that the cultural context really matters, and it matters in two ways. I mean, for one thing, not only then, but now in many respects, when people get married I think it's very funny that I am here telling you what happens when people get married. I've never been married. In fact, I've refused to be married on many occasions. But marriage was and remains in many cultures something else than love. It's about the union of families, the transmission of property, the making of alliances, things that are very important, the raising of children, but that had nothing to do with love. And I mean, I'm not telling anyone anything they probably don't know. And that notion of companionate marriage, of marriage for love, is historically speaking, a relatively recent and isolated phenomenon. So in the absence of that, how did people find friendship? And common space is clearly really important. And I cannot explain, and I'm not sure I know I don't fully understand what the importance of physical presence is for friendship, but I think it is. And I felt this very vividly in the days of the pandemic and Zoom, that there was a kind of poverty in that writing to friends is not enough. It is something, and social media cultivates something, but there is something about physical presence, and I think it has something to do with the presence of the visibility of our physical humanity, that we are all, I hope, elevate a dark phrase, we are all human animals. We are animals. And our animality, the recognition of the humanity in that animality, that is also an important part. So common space matters, I think, quite a bit. And I think we're also in a really shifting moment. Of course, time practices shift all the time, but our understanding of marriage is changing yet again. Our understandings of sexuality are, I think, very much in flux, and I think that's all to the good. And our understanding of friendship remains really inchoate. So what will come out of these reconsiderations, I don't know. But I think in general that the uncertainty that we find ourselves in is quite potentially productive, that something can hatch here.
Great. So last question, and then we'll open up for questions. Is there something about friendship that you want to preserve, as in not being instrumentalized, right? Like friendship training for democracy, friendship teaching us something about how to live together in a democracy and so on. But is there something about friendship in an effective connection that is, just you want to sort of preserve sort of outside of that political realm as an instrument for democratic politics?
Yeah, I want it to be lawless and unregulated. I don't want anyone telling anyone else about how their friendship should be conducted or who they should be friends with or what this entails on them. They should just let it be. Just let them do as they choose. And because each friendship will have a radical particularity, and that is because they answer to the particular needs and capacities and beauties of those people.
Oh, we have a question here.
Yeah, thank you very much for this moving talk, Anne. My question is, I'm struggling with the relationship between friendship and truth. Where so Roger said humanity should be prioritized over truth. And I don't mean truth in the sense of right and wrong, but in the sense of acknowledging facts, factualities. And I'm saying this as a German coming from a society, a post-Nazi, post-Holocaust society. Just last week, I stumbled over a correspondence in the internet between Hannah Arendt and Benno von Wiese. Benno von Wiese was a professor, I think philosophy professor in Germany, close friend of Hannah Arendt before 1933, and then he turned a Nazi, betrayed her. They weren't in touch until I think 1950, when they got together again, and Hannah Arendt, in her generosity, befriended him again. And then in 1965, he wrote an article in Germany in the Zeit, claiming that the young generation should not ask the elder generation all these questions about and shouldn't challenge them so much, and they should just accept that it was difficult at the time and that they were in a certain ideology, the zeitgeist, blah blah blah. And Hannah Arendt wrote him a letter saying, you know what, I knew you at the time. You had no issue with ideology, and you are just a coward. You are a coward, and I know that you are. And so they had back and forth letters, and then she finished this conversation saying, you know what, I don't care. Let's just be friends again. You're a coward. It's fine. And really, they continued as friends. It's amazing. But so she had the chance to know that he was a coward. Yeah, but in a society where truth, factual truth, that guy is a coward, this one is an ideologist, is blurred. So the possibilities for friendship and for trust, I think, are much, much less and much harder to find than in societies where truth, factual truth, is valued. So maybe we can also think about this kind of politics of truth
Yes,
also.
I thought about this when Roger was talking about some of Arendt's relationships. In some ways, the question you're raising is, if you know the truth of someone, can you still be friends with them? Should you still be friends with them? I am not sure I agree with Arendt about that. I think there might be things where you say, absolutely, I cannot be friends with you. It would not be honorable for me to be friends with you. I would betray something in myself, and I would betray something in you, because I would not tell you no. But at the same time, I'm not willing to say I'm right about this. I think it is a question. I'm very curious about what that relationship of friendship and truth is. I can see having some withdrawal from truth as an imperative. I think truth is what we struggle towards, but we rarely have a perfect possession of it. And so the admission of fallibility, the acknowledgement of limits, that's important, and that is particularly important in friendship. But here it seems like it sounded to me as though Hannah Arendt there was nothing she needed to know. There was no question of fallibility. She was just setting something aside. And I don't know how much you can set aside.
Thank you very much for your wonderful comments. I wanted to ask you about your statement of separating sexuality from property. It seems to me that connection has been an important pillar of social organization for several centuries. And so it strikes me that it's not easy to change. In a second question, I work hard at friendships. So Habermas says you have to look for mutual understanding in your communication. And to me, that is very hard. But it's the essence of friendship, is being able to communicate and have mutual understanding. Thank you very much.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That connection between sexuality and property, it's not just centuries, it's millennia. But I think that it's not been good. That is to say, and to some extent, everything has its virtues and its vices. It has produced stability, but we are now living through, I think, the pathologies of that relationship, and indeed probably of our understanding of property as a whole. And we have been readier to examine our relationship to sexuality than we have our relationship to property. So I'm prepared to just put all these things in question, however disruptive it might prove. On the question of mutual understanding, yes, it is hard. And I think sometimes we picture that too much as a problem. I think that, I mean, of course, sometimes misunderstandings can be fraught and unpleasant and burdensome. But sometimes the fact that someone understands, that your friend understands something very differently than you do, it can surprise you with new learning. That you can start to see something in a way radically different than you did before. This is the only example I can think of, and it's from a different frame. But in the Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon, she talks about spring colors, and it becomes visible in the text that the colors she thinks are most evocative of spring are dark maroon and light green. And I found this was, of course, completely at odds with the aesthetics I had inherited. But the more I thought about it, the more I saw that this was the color of a new leaf on a twig. And it enabled me to see, not only to see systems of color differently, but also to see the spring world somewhat differently than I had before. And I think that when you confront something with a friend, or indeed with anyone, but particularly with a friend that seems unfathomable to you, it also becomes sometimes a surprise, like a big present that you get to unwrap. And although there's some minor work in unwrapping the present, it is, after all, a present. And so finding that common understanding isn't just a struggle, it's also a pleasure.
Hi, thanks very much for an illuminating and modest, in the best sense, talk. I wanted to focus on what I understand as a difference between, or at least I think I understand, as a difference between what you were saying and what Roger was saying, which raises a question for me that I'd be interested to hear from you about. So as I understood Roger's, what Roger was saying, for Arendt, the politics is the basis for friendship, and then Roger was saying that the question that then emerges is, who are my friends? And the implicit idea is that the friends are those who are within the political community, and enemies are those who are beyond the political community. And I understood you to be saying something different, which is that that friendship is a training for politics, but that they're not the same, that the bond that holds friends together is not the bond that holds politics together. So the experience of friendship can prepare us for democratic politics, but it's a different bond. And so one question is whether you think I'm understanding that correctly, but maybe even without that, even if that's not accurate, the question to you is how, if it's right that, that it's a different bond, how do you like to talk about the bond that holds the political community together? And particularly, why is it useful to distinguish that from friendship, to say that these are two different things?
I didn't understand Roger saying that. I understood Roger as saying, or as reading Arendt as saying that, that there was a sense in which a friendship is separate from, independent of, and in some ways at odds with political community. That is, it is what does she call it? A little world, a micro world. And there I am entirely in agreement with her. I think that that's true. I was really happy to learn that about her work, and I want to find out where it is. And that relation to politics is very important. Now, one of the reasons why, this is another reason why I think there's a good, there are political virtues in friendship. And one of them is that resistance to being subsumed in a whole that you do not know. I mean, you can never know your whole polity, but you in the way you know your friend. And so there should be, I think, more distance. I also, and this is admittedly a preference, I prefer politics with a lot of diversity at every level, and a pretty high degree of contention, which is why I am a Democrat. I kind of like a small d Democrat. I kind of like the scrum. I want to see people saying, no, I don't think that's true. That I think is good for humans, because it says, you judge. It makes you judge. It makes you not say, oh, I'm just following the law. You have to judge. You have to fight a little. And those, I think, are good things. So the fact that you have many people, or ideally, you would have people who had little worlds of their own that were rich and valuable to them to an infinite degree. And so on the one hand, you would know that they had something that was valuable and demanding and good. And on the other hand, you would know they were not necessarily yours. In fact, they were definitely not yours. They were theirs. And that ability to accept multiple forms of life in a single space is a kind of it is something that democracies foster. That's what Al-Farabi wrote back in the day, and I have found it to be entirely credible, that they foster many different forms of life and community. and things smaller, friendship. So I think that's a good thing. It is true that for people who really love deep community in which there is a great deal of sameness, that will be a very uncomfortable way of life. But I think friendship is a threat to those people in ways that it is not a threat to Democrats.
Are there any student questions? Oh,
There's this woman.
and then we'll go to.
Yeah.
Hi, I want to sort of push back on the idea that friendship just happens. I think that's a privileged view. I think that there are many, many people living in this world that spring from dysfunctional, distorted family situations that doesn't happen for. And I think that that is part of what Naomi brought to our attention in the dialogues with the young men, that this is something that as a society we need to think about, because we have an abundance of youth coming up that don't understand how to even commence the process of a friendship. Partly because they were not exposed to that in their home because of the challenges of dysfunctional family. So I would sort of like you to think about that and comment on that, please.
I agree that there is something privileged about my view in two respects. I mean, one, because I had the happiness of an extremely functional family. It was eccentric in various ways, but it was and remains a place of love and security. And I know that is, I learned at an early age that that is in many ways not the norm. I have, however, in very recent years, come to know people, one person in particular, from highly dysfunctional, deeply traumatized, and abusive families. And yet, the person I know best in this situation is very good, is a very good friend, and has found and made friendship. I don't think friendship is simply magic. I think you do have to work at it, and I think there are things we can do as people to cultivate it. But I think that there will always be an element of chance and luck and grace about it. That there is, I would not say to people who have no friends, or to people who at that moment have no friends, it is because you haven't done enough. Or I would not say it's because society hasn't done enough for you. That there will always be that possibility of friendship, and there will never be, I think, institutions that make it inevitable. That there will be that element of chance. And I know that for the abused and traumatized people that I know, friendship has been a refuge and a triumph.
Any? So let's take a student question here in the middle. There are a couple. Yeah, right there, beginning here.
Yeah, thank you so much. So you kind of brought up like the connection between friendship and capital, which I thought was really interesting. I was kind of like thinking about and wondering if you think that, perhaps people, maybe specifically children, I guess, who kind of come from like a wealthier family, a family with more physical capital, have a kind of like structural advantage at like the ability to make friendships. Perhaps if they have more free time, they have access to more community spaces, and they, are sent to like a certain type of school. I was wondering if you kind of see like a link there and think that, some people in that sense are perhaps advantaged in the access they have to ability to make friendships.
I think you're quite right in saying it's very, very important. but I think it sometimes works the other way. That, I mean, the fundamental point that I think you're making is that there has to be, and Aristotle says this, and he's really quite good on friendship, is there has to be a kind of rough equality in friendship at the economic level. Because if someone is always able to give and the other must always receive, that's not a great relationship. It will, as particularly, I think, if I imagine that if there is a person of great wealth, there might be a tendency of other people to withdraw. I can't invite this person over to my house. Their house is beautiful. My house is crowded and not beautiful. That there can be bars to friendship in that sense for the privileged person, for the wealthy person. And I think also because friendship really does prosper when people do things in common and take care of each other, that people who are relatively less privileged or even very less privileged, they have to depend on each other. So you might find people you can depend on more quickly, and you might move more rapidly to a situation of trust. But luckily, none of this is determinative.
Thank you, Anne. I really enjoyed that. I was going to ask you perhaps to say a bit more about negative or more ambiguous or ambivalent emotions in friendship. I was quite struck by how you were talking about the fact that a lot of people who do go to college find a lot of friends in college, and then the idea of staying in the academia as a way to, in a manner of speaking, continue that kind of engagement. But as we know, academic friendships, as all other friendships, also involve quite a degree of, competition, occasional resentment, envy, etc., as all other friendships do. So I'm wondering if you could say something about that. How do we see the kind of the less unequivocally positive sides of friendship, and especially how that relates to politics?
I'm not a Marxist, but I'm going to sound like a Marxist today. I mean, I'm an anarchist, but this is the sort of. Anyway, forget it's economic inequality is a huge problem here. And I mean, one of the most horrible things I have ever heard in my life was when someone who I valued turned to me and said in passing, "I'm a failure." And just in passing, in reference to something else, and I said, "What do you mean?" And it was because he hadn't made enough money. And I said, "What do you value?" And that wasn't what he valued. But he was still to himself a failure. And that does indeed, and of course in academia, we add an extra layer to this. You're better known, you have more articles, or whatever it is, or what is that thing that they have on Google? On Google Scholar Index or whatever. Yeah, all those things. So we have lots of ways in which you could be a failure, or you could be a success, some of which are pretty rubbish. And so you have to really, those are dangerous, and they are absolutely. They're weapons people can easily use against each other to obtain an advantage of one kind or another, and that is destructive to friendship. They can make certain kinds of friendships harder or impossible. Property has a lot to answer for in our culture, or our understanding of property does. And this is one of those things that that it makes friendship harder. I don't think that totally, I think you also want me to look at the dark side of friendship. And what is the dark side of friendship? It is true that I have to say, and in here, in this sense, I am truly privileged that that of all the relationships I have lived in, friendship has been the one that is least dark. It is not without darkness, but the darkness tends to be fear for your friend, that you take your friend's suffering with your own, that friends die. These things are dark, but the content of the friendship itself has never been that for me, and that is lucky. But I think it is also because friendship is constantly remaking itself, and so there are more correctives built in than there are to more regulated and governed relationships.
So I've been told we have time for one more. That's it.
Thanks. So you mentioned that you were interested in the possibility of like things being uncertain as pertains, for example, to the transfer of property relationships through sexual relationships, and also some uncertainty about friendship and what it means. And I'm roping that in with the comments that you made about homosocial relationships and how those, historically, back in the time of the Greeks, were these relationships that were mentorship-based and were a source of political capital and access to all sorts of different opportunities, and also in the Victorian era. And I'm also wrapping that into a little bit of this, Professor Wei's work on the lack of intimacy in male relationships, as would have been typical in sort of the homosocial relationships. And I'm just wondering if, within this light of uncertainty, if this breakdown of that intimate relationship between men, because also I look at that as a woman and I say, I still see a clubbiness and an access-driven relationship among men that is very vital, and I don't see that dissipating wholesale right now. And so I'm wondering, like, in this era of uncertainty, in terms of this sort of breaking down of this intimate relationship among men, what could that evolve? Could that evolve towards something that friendship as a source of political capital creates an opportunity for women to sort of insert themselves into this dynamic and to make it be more fluid, because I think coining this sort of intimate relationship among boys scares me a little bit, like I like this more, sort of flipping the gender identity, the queerness, how do we, maybe this is something that's evolving into relationships among gender fluid or, sexually unimportant relationships, that intimacy could be spread around, the access could be spread around.
I think there are two big places where I see radical uncertainty, particularly for us in the West, in the United States, but generally. And one is sexuality, and the other is we are no longer culturally separate to the extent that we were before. That is to say, I would bet that very few people, and I would bet a lot on it, that very few people in this room don't know anyone in another country. Most people have been to another country. Probably most have lived in another country. That they have relations in another country, or more, usually more, that they themselves may have multiple citizenships. This is normal for us now. It was not so normal for my generation, although it is how I grew up, but it is normal for my students and the young people that I know. And even if it's not true for them, they have access to it through social media, through all, as one of my young friends would say, all the ways. They have all the things that make those things visible to them. So there is a lot of cultural disruption or cosmopolitanism. But it's very particular. And that, I think, is good, because I like uncertainty, but it's also very hard to live with in many ways. You don't know. Like, if you go to a new country, one of the first things you have to learn is what is polite. How could you inadvertently hurt someone's feelings? How could you inadvertently insult someone? And when there's more of that, and the rules are less certain, you have a lot of work to do all the time, and that's hard. But at the same time, when relations are reforming, and of course the other place where relationships are reforming is everything is much queerer than it used to be. And we don't know what, we finally know, I think, that we really know nothing about sexuality. We like to pretend we know. And we pretend we know truths about sexuality that we don't know at all. But we will be forced to a full recognition of the fact that we know nothing, and that is a good thing. Because then we will have to think a little bit. And then we will also have to we'll have to decide how we want to live with each other in terms of intimacy. What we regard as expressions of love and desire and erotics, we have to do that all over again and figure it out, and people will figure it out differently. And that, I think, will make available to us new ways of thinking about all these very important aspects of our life. I don't think it will be comfortable, but I think it will be very interesting and potentially really valuable.